It started without a plan, without anger, and without any real reason other than curiosity. The kind of curiosity that tells you to click when you shouldn't, to test a door just to see if it's locked. And on that quiet night, with nothing to prove and no one watching, the hacker logged in for fun. Not to steal, not to destroy, but to feel that small rush of getting somewhere they weren't supposed to be. And at first it felt harmless, almost boring, like opening a room and finding it empty. Yet in that moment, something invisible shifted, because the instant the system responded, the game stopped being a game, even though the hacker didn't realize it yet. And while everything still looked normal on the surface, that single connection marked a line that could not be uncrossed, a moment where curiosity quietly turned into commitment. And if you're watching this right now thinking you would have closed the tab and walked away, that's exactly what everyone thinks before they make the same mistake, which is why you need to stay until the end, because missing one detail is how this story, and situations like it, spiral out of control. There was no target in mind, no name written down, no grand objective driving the action, because this wasn't an attack, it was exploration, the kind that starts with scanning open doors and ends with curiosity pulling you forward step by step. And to the hacker, this felt routine, almost boring. Just another system that happened to be exposed, another quiet space where no alarms rang and no warnings appeared, and the ease of it all was what made it interesting. Because systems weren't supposed to open like this, not without resistance, not without effort, yet this one did. And with every layer accessed, the sense of control grew stronger, not in an aggressive way, but in a calm, detached way, like standing somewhere high above the world and realizing no one could see you, and that feeling was addictive, not because of power, but because of silence. Because nothing pushed back, nothing questioned the presence, and the deeper they went, the more it felt like the system was waiting rather than being broken into, which planted a quiet thought that didn't make sense yet, a question the hacker ignored at the time, wondering why something this important felt so empty, so open, and so willing to let a stranger walk in without asking who they were. The first sign came so small it was almost laughable, a timestamp that updated without a command, a permission that refreshed itself a second faster than expected, little movements that could be dismissed as automation or background processes. And the hacker did exactly that, brushing it off as normal system behavior. Yet the longer they stayed, the more those small details stopped lining up, because logs began to shift in real time. Directories reorganized themselves and access paths changed, just enough to be noticed, not enough to block entry, but enough to be felt. And that was when the silence started to feel different, heavier, like a room where someone else had just walked in without making a sound. And then there was the file, sitting where nothing should have been, named in a way the hacker knew they hadn't typed, dated seconds after their own access began, which introduced a thought they couldn't shake anymore. The possibility that this system wasn't reacting automatically, but responding. And as that idea settled in, the hacker had to confront a question that changed everything, whether they had broken into the system first, or whether the system had been waiting for someone like them all along. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, through behaviors that felt personal even though no one had spoken yet, because the tools that once worked instantly now hesitated. Commands took longer to respond, permissions narrowed in subtle ways that followed the hacker's movements, and it became clear that access wasn't disappearing randomly, it was being shaped, adjusted in response to what they tried next. And that was the moment the balance tipped, when observation stopped feeling one-sided, because every action seemed anticipated, every path slightly redirected, as if the system already knew where they were going before they got there, and the confidence that came with invisibility began to crack, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that anonymity might be an illusion. And the most unsettling part wasn't that access was restricted, it was that it wasn't cut off completely, because the system still allowed entry, still allowed movement, just enough to keep the hacker inside, just enough to make leaving feel premature. And as that realization settled in, one truth became impossible to ignore. They were no longer exploring a system from the outside. They were inside something that was actively paying attention to them. The moment the hacker decided to leave was the moment everything tightened. Because disconnecting should have been simple. A clean break, a closed session, a forgotten trace. Yet every attempt to pull away created new complications instead of relief. Sessions reappeared after being terminated, access tokens regenerated without request, and connections lingered just long enough to make cutting them feel risky, as if forcefully exiting would draw more attention than staying. And the deeper problem revealed itself in fragments, linked accounts that hadn't existed before, mirrored access points forming where none had been opened, and trails beginning to connect actions that were never meant to touch each other, turning what started as a harmless curiosity into a tangled presence that couldn't be undone without consequences. And in that moment, the hacker understood something crucial, that walking away wasn't neutral anymore, because leaving would not erase what had already been seen, and staying, as dangerous as it felt, seemed like the only way to avoid triggering something worse, marking the exact point where curiosity crossed into commitment and where escape stopped being an option and became a risk. The realization didn't arrive with a warning or a message. It arrived through absence, through the unsettling fact that activity was being noticed without being challenged. Because access logs were clearly being viewed, yet nothing was blocked, no alerts were triggered, and no defensive measures were deployed, creating a silence that felt intentional rather than accidental. And that silence carried weight, suggesting that whatever or whoever was watching had no need to rush, no need to confront, because they already had time on their side. And the hacker began to sense that this wasn't law enforcement or automated monitoring, not yet, but something quieter and far more patient, something content with observation, allowing the presence to continue while quietly collecting patterns, behaviors, decisions, and hesitation. And the longer this invisible observation stretched on, the more the hacker understood that the danger wasn't in being caught suddenly, it was in being allowed to continue unchecked, because that kind of permission implied preparation. And as the system remained open, responsive, and eerily calm, one disturbing thought settled in, that they weren't being stopped because they weren't finished being studied yet. The mistake didn't feel like a mistake at the time. It felt like a small, reasonable choice made out of curiosity and frustration, a single action meant to answer a question that had been lingering too long. And that was exactly why it worked. Because the system didn't react slowly or gradually this time, it responded instantly. Access pathways collapsed in on themselves, permissions that once shifted gently now locked into place, and areas that had remained open vanished all at once, as if the system had been waiting for that exact move. And in that instant, the hacker realized that the action hadn't revealed new information about the system. It had revealed something about them, their habits, their priorities, the way they thought under pressure. And whatever had been watching no longer needed to observe, because the final pattern had been confirmed. And the most unsettling part wasn't the sudden loss of freedom, it was the clarity of it, the understanding that this outcome had been decided long before the mistake was made, and that the system hadn't been testing security, it had been testing the person on the other side. The realization arrived slowly, not as panic, but as clarity. Because in the stillness that followed the lock-in, the hacker finally saw the shape of what they had stepped into. Understanding that this was never about breaking defenses or stealing access, and that nothing inside the system had been truly valuable on its own, because the real focus had always been behavior, reaction, restraint, and curiosity. And it became clear that the openness, the silence, and the subtle resistance were not flaws but features, carefully designed to attract the exact kind of person who would keep going without being asked. And in that moment, the hacker understood they were never an intruder. They were a participant, drawn in by freedom that wasn't real, measured by choices they thought were private, and guided toward a conclusion they hadn't noticed forming, realizing too late that the system hadn't been compromised at all, because from the very first login, it had been working exactly as intended. Leaving didn't come with alarms, warnings, or a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, through the slow collapse of options that once felt stable. Because even after access was gone and the system was no longer reachable, the consequences continued to unfold outside the screen. opportunities fading without explanation, connections failing at the worst moments, and paths closing that had nothing to do with code, yet somehow traced back to that single night. And the hacker began to understand that escape had never meant logging out, because what had been taken wasn't data or control, it was certainty, the confidence that actions could exist without echo. And there was no moment of capture or exposure to point to, just a growing awareness that something unseen had already made its assessment and moved on, leaving the hacker free in the technical sense, but permanently marked in every way that mattered. Realizing at last that some systems don't need to hold you to keep you trapped, they only need to let you go. So, was the hacker trapped by the system or by their own curiosity? The same curiosity that whispered just one more click and led them further than they ever intended. And as you watch this story unfold, ask yourself how often you ignore small warnings, how often you think harmless curiosity has no consequences. Because in a world full of unseen watchers and doors that shouldn't be opened, the difference between thrill and trap can be invisible. And if this story made you question your own choices, pause for a moment and comment where you're watching from. Share your thoughts on what you would have done, and subscribe now, because these aren't just stories of hackers and systems, they are lessons about attention, consequence, and the line between freedom and control that can vanish in an instant.